Today, our presentation is funded by Humanities Washington. Clyde Ford was an instructor at Western Washington University, where he taught the Introduction to African American Experience. He's also a prolific author. His books include We Can All Get Along, 50 Steps You Can Take to Help End Racism, and The Long Mile, for which he received the Zora Neale Hurston Wright Award. He was a featured guest on Oprah Winfrey and has spoken often on NPR and other media outlets. I'm sure many of you remember, as I do, his passionate speeches in the rotunda of Bellingham City Hall when we celebrated Martin Luther King Day there, a celebration he helped found. And I really can't sit down without mentioning Clyde's alter ego, Charlie Noble. That's the hero of a mystery series, a man who lives on his boat in thinly disguised Squalicum Harbor. Besides the murders and mayhem, the best parts of the book were trying to identify the familiar sights he so vividly described. Please welcome this man for all seasons, Clyde Ford.
Thank you all so much. It's really nice to be home. And listening to Jane, I just really had to laugh. Thank you for mentioning Charlie Noble. I don't know how many people know those Charlie Noble books, but oh my gosh. All right, thank you, because those were the most fun books that I wrote because they're here at my home in Bellingham. And I have to ask, as I look around and see so many friends and so many faces I've known for so many years, how many people were here the last time I spoke at City Club? Wow, okay. So, and the reason I mention that is that I again, listened to Jane say just a little bit about my background, and she mentioned the Oprah Winfrey Show, and it was because of the book that got me on the Oprah Winfrey Show that I was here to speak at City Club, and that was the book, We Can All Get Along, 50 Steps You Can Take to Help End Racism. And so it's kind of interesting to come back to the City Club and speak about race, because the last time I was here, that's exactly what we were discussing as well, too. And I also want to say how much I appreciate the role that City Club plays in this community, and also the role that Humanities Washington, may I have my glass of water? The role that Humanities Washington plays here in the state. Through Humanities Washington, I have traveled for the last, it's probably been almost 3 months now. I think I've been home maybe a day or two a week, and the other times I'm traveling to places for Humanities Washington. And that has included places like the Coyote Ridge Correctional Facility in Connell, Washington, Washington State Penitentiary, Longview, where I spoke at the college there, Orcas Island, several times on Bainbridge Island, here in Ferndale, in Woodinville. I mean, I really have traveled the state thanks to Humanities Washington. It's a great program in that it does bring to many diverse corners of the state programs and speakers and ideas that I don't think they would get outside of Humanities Washington. So again, I just want to emphasize what Jane said. Please fill out those evaluation forms. Not only do they tell Humanities Washington whether they want to have speakers like me, but they also, more importantly, help with the funding from places like the National Endowments for the Humanities. It was probably about 20 years ago when I first went to Germany. I was a little concerned about doing that. You know, black guy going to Germany, I was a little concerned about what that experience might be like. One of the things I learned, I was teaching there. I was teaching in a small village outside of Freiburg, a place called Kirchzarten. The Germans have a word called schwer, which kind of sounds like exactly what it is, severe or intense. And one of the things that I observed among the folks who I was being an instructor for is the extent to which whatever we engaged in class, the discussion was severe, intensiv, as they would also say in Germany. Very intense, very engaged. It was like what would normally take maybe 2 or 3 minutes of discussion here in the States took 10, 15, 20 minutes, or even part of a morning, which really threw off my teaching schedule. So I asked the folks, why is that? And what they said to me really stuck. They said, we want to fully discuss whatever issue it is so we don't miss anything and repeat what happened in 1930s and early 1940s. Wow. Wow. Oh, maybe about 15 years ago, I was in South Africa. My sister was teaching at the University of Witwatersrand, and she lived in Joburg. And I was also really impressed with many of the people I met there. Not everyone, but many of the people. This was not too long after Mandela had been released from the prison on Robben Island. And one of the things that was implemented, instituted after his release, and really trying to reinvigorate South African society, was the notion of truth and reconciliation committees. And I see some of you shaking your head, so you know that the Truth and Reconciliation Committees, some of the larger ones run by people like Desmond Tutu, were set up in order to bring together those who had committed some of the worst atrocities during apartheid with those who had been the victims of some of those horrible atrocities, with the idea that if you, as the perpetrator, came in front of those who you may have perpetrated these horrendous crimes often on, and you were able to truthfully and forthrightly disclose what it was you did, and also sit there and listen to how you impacted lives, that if you were to do that, then the Truth and Reconciliation Committees would consider amnesty. And while certainly it's not a perfect solution, and many people point to some of the challenges, obviously, that South Africa still has, I think it's an important step in how we get beyond the notion of retributive justice to restorative justice. And the central part of restorative justice is how you have a conversation about a really, really difficult topic. Certainly South Africa, that was a very difficult topic, apartheid, to have that conversation about, as was in Germany, the Third Reich, and Nazi Germany as well, too. Unfortunately, in this country, we don't have that tradition of having conversations around difficult topics. We're trained in school to have what I call the talking heads colliding conversations, right? Let's have a debate. And in a debate, then, you have a winner and a loser. In restorative justice, you don't have a winner and a loser. You have a way of moving beyond the challenges that got you into the problems in the first place. You know, I like to quote, or paraphrase, I should say, Oscar Wilde at this moment. Oscar Wilde had a saying about Unitarians. I'll tell you what the real saying was later. Hey, I grew up a Unitarian, so I don't mind saying that. But basically, from this point of view, Oscar Wilde would say, when faced with the need to have a difficult conversation, or the ability to prove that a difficult conversation wasn't really necessary, most Americans get busy on the proof. What I would like to do today is to give you some thoughts, ideas, maybe even some guidelines about how it is we might proceed in having a difficult conversation about race in this country. Now, I mean, the first question is, or really the first observation is, this is something which has not in any way receded from our national discourse. If anything, it has even emerged more in front of us in terms of our national discourse. And so we might then ask the question, and let's see if this, oh, look at this. Now, I'm going to be showing some slides on that side, and I'm always amazed when my technology works. So it does today. And so the first thing, I would ask is, why even have a difficult conversation about race? Well, from simply looking at the news, I think you can say that it's an issue that's unresolved, and it ain't going away by itself. Now, I'm sure many of you know from let's say, relationships and the challenging conversations that often happen or need to happen in relationships, that sometimes you'll be, or maybe you are with, or have been with a partner who thinks, well, if I don't talk about it, it'll go away. I won't ask you to raise your hands because I'm sure, I think there's a lot of people that might raise their hands if I did ask you to do that. But I will say that we know what it's like avoiding or not having a conversation that's difficult. And I think we probably realize because of that, that just because you don't have a conversation doesn't mean the issue is going to go away. In fact, more often than not, when you don't have the conversation you need to have, that issue emerges even more so and throughout whatever the engagement you have is with that other person, with that society, which is why I so appreciated that German mindset. Even though the issue wasn't about the Third Reich and Nazism, the mindset was, let's have the conversation, because that way, if we get into the habit of having it, we will never fall into the situation that we fell in before. Really, I thought a really great thing. Look, if we don't talk about it, a difficult issue like race, we're going to fight about it. You see that fight manifesting itself on the southern border with militia there. You saw that fight manifesting itself in Charlottesville. You know, if you don't talk about it, I can guarantee you're going to fight about it. You know, I also feel that you want to have a difficult conversation because it may be the only way to bridge differences and bring about change. I can safely tell you that you don't bring about change by yelling at somebody. In fact, more than anything, if you yell at somebody about how wrong they are, there's a good chance what you're simply going to do is create more of a shell, more of a division, more of a chasm. You've got to find a way to bridge the gap between people, and one of the ways you do that is having a difficult conversation. I can say that I know a little bit about having difficult conversations because my training, among other things, is as a psychotherapist. And I've had the opportunity to be on both sides of the table because when you go through psychotherapy school, you don't get out without undergoing psychotherapy yourself. And one of the things we learn as psychotherapists, and I'm sure any of you have done therapy at any point of your life know this, is that most people come to a therapy session and say, well, you know, there's a lot of it. I'll talk about these issues on this side. These are the issues I can talk about. We used to call them the A-list. And then they'll say, I got these B-list over here, and I don't know that I really, really want to talk about those issues. And any good psychotherapist knows, yeah, the A-list is there, but any good psychotherapist really knows you got to get to the B-list. That's the difficult conversation. That's where you help a person bring about change in their lives. And, you know, I would say this in any number of situations. You learn, certainly I did in psychotherapy, I'm sure perhaps you've learned in your own relationships and in life. The way to change other people is to change yourself first. And the way you begin about changing yourself, particularly if it's in a difficult conversation about an issue like race, is you learn how to engage with that conversation. So you're not just debating, but you're talking in ways that allow that conversation to unfold. And that's really what I want to share with you today. And so I might even ask, and I like to do this just because people often have a lot more insight into why having a difficult conversation about race than I can always come up with. And so let me just take a couple of hands from the audience and ask you, why have a difficult conversation about an issue like race? Anybody? Yes, standing up. Okay, thank you. We do it to honor those who have suffered. Yes, all the way in the back. Okay, thank you. Learning and education. Anyone else?
To connect with other people that are different than we are.
Okay, so for connection.
They're only different in some ways.
So for connection and to realizing the differences and maybe the similarities as well too. Am I right in rephrasing it that way? Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Chris.
Because there are bigger issues to deal with, we need to be able to work together on those, and something like race gets in the way of.
Thank you. So again, if I heard you, it's because there are other larger issues to deal with, And so why let something like skin color get in the way of dealing with those larger issues? Did I get you? Am I feeling you there, brother? All right. Okay. We'll take two more. Oh, in the middle back, kind of there. Yes. You, sir, in the red shirt.
To drive your point of view, kind of contrary to what we're hearing.
Okay. So this gentleman wants to have a conversation to drive his point of view home, I'm assuming. I didn't hear the last part. Thank you. And right here. Okay, thank you for saying that, to get over the fear of having the conversation. I know we probably have some other ones. I'm going to stop here and just move on to the next slide and say, hey, why avoid having a conversation about race? Well, you know, what I hear a lot is, I'm afraid of revealing what I truly feel. And one of the reasons I'm afraid of revealing what I truly feel is that, one, people won't understand me if I do, and two, if I really do that, people will call me a, underline, you fill in the word yourself. So, I'll ask the questions again. Why are some of the other reasons that we might want to avoid having a difficult conversation? Rod. Okay, so I'm going to repeat that. Maybe I don't know what I really feel about race, and so I'm afraid to have that discussion because of that. Thank you. Yes?
Concerned to be offensive or offend us. It's hard to have some discussion.
So let me see if I heard you right. You said afraid to be offensive or offending. Did I get that right? Yeah, okay, thank you. Yes? Okay, I think I got you. So let's avoid the conversation, because if we do have the conversation, it's going to devolve into combat, and it actually might devolve into something which costs people their lives. Thank you. Anyone else? Sure. So if we have this conversation, we may break a relationship, like sitting around the Thanksgiving table. So like one of those things, like religion and politics, let's not talk about it, because that'll make it that much easier. Anyone else? Yeah. So what I hear, there is some real confusion about the definitions that we're using to even have that conversation. Did I get you right there? Good. Thank you. Anyone else? So if we have, let's say, let me rephrase what you're saying, check me if I'm right. If it's better to avoid the conversation, because if we have it, I might have to give something up that I cherish, like my privilege in some way or another. Okay? Did I get you right there? Thank you. So what I also find interesting, and I think I kind of hear as well too, is it's kind of harkens back to what I said about with Oscar Wilde's paraphrasing of what Americans are more easily set upon doing. And that is, a lot of times it's a lot easier to have reasons for avoiding the conversation than it is for having the conversation. The number of reasons that people can come up with, I think, is interesting, and it often points to some of the challenges. So what do you do? Well, I think that you have a conversation about a difficult topic like race based on 3 building blocks. And you heard the need for some of these actually in the comments that people made when I asked some of those questions. And I think you've got to start with some basic definitions. I can't imagine that you can really have a decent conversation unless you start with some definitions. And I'll give you some definitions that I think we need to start this conversation about race. The other thing, and this comes directly from my experience as a psychotherapist, is you need to know what is active listening all about. And I want to share with you what I think active listening is about. And finally, I don't think you can engage in a conversation about a difficult topic unless you can engage from your heart and not from your head. And I'll tell you a really marvelous story when we get to that part about something that just recently happened to me for Humanities Washington when I was speaking at the Coyote Ridge Correctional Facility. But let's start with basic definitions. And this is something that actually comes from my earlier book. It's not my definition. It comes from my book, We Can All Get Along, 50 Steps You Can Take to Help End Racism. It is a basic definition about race and racism that comes from the 1970 Kerner Commission. Some of you may remember that the Kerner Commission was impaneled by Lyndon Baines Johnson after the 1968 and 1969 summers, you know, the summers when King was killed, when Kennedy was killed, and when cities were really in a rebellion in this country. And the question that was put before the 1970 Kerner Commission was, why did it happen, and what do we need to do to stop that? Boy, you know, when you look back at what happened in 1970, particularly with the Kerner Commission, it's amazing to see the extent to which our country, and particularly our political leaders, were willing to go to look at these really difficult issues. I was amazed when I went back and looked at the political affiliations of the members on the Kerner Commission, the original one, of how many people on that commission, unfortunately they were mostly men, but were Southern, white, Republicans and Democrats, which I found really interesting because that commission did some really good things in terms of establishing the reasons why we had those problems in this country and some of the steps we ought to be taking. Unfortunately, 50 years after the Kerner Commission's report, the Kerner Commission, or at least the surviving members, reissued another report just last year saying how little progress had been made in 50 years and actually pointing to the areas in which, instead of progress, you see a decline in the very issues that they spoke about. But what was important in that committee's report, in that book, and if you take nothing else away from this presentation, it is the definition of race and the difference between race and prejudice. So the Kerner Commission said, look, anybody can be prejudiced. In fact, most of us are. Prejudice in some way is probably a developmental point of view that allowed us to be safe. You know, we were prejudiced in thinking that, oh, that saber-toothed tiger is probably not going to be a friend to me, okay? It's a prejudgment. I mean, you don't walk up to the saber-toothed tiger and ask, you know, am I going to be dinner? But prejudice itself, and I can be prejudiced for any number of reasons, right? You might be too short and I don't like you. You're too tall and I don't like you. You weigh too much and I don't like you. You don't have enough hair and I don't like you. You have too much hair and I don't like you. Your hair is gray. Your hair is, you know, blue or purple. You've got tattoos. I don't like your skin color. I mean, you can have so many things that you can be prejudiced about. And some of those are just plain stupidity. Prejudice means you prejudge before you have all the information. But the Kerner Commission said that simple prejudice doesn't rise to the level of racism. They said that you need to have the power to impact somebody in a significant way, educationally, politically, economically, you name it. With that power, law enforcement-wise, when power is connected to prejudice, that's when it rises to the level of racism. You know, every time I go back and read that definition, I kind of breathe a sigh of relief, and a lot of other people do too. And you will find me screaming at my radio because I don't care whether it's NPR or whether it's CNN, this level of understanding just doesn't exist in the media. You know, you're either racist or you're not. Well, no, it's not that simple. You can be prejudiced, but unless you have the power, it doesn't equate to racism. Now, the importance of an idea like this is in any number of ways, but here's one of the ways it's important. You often hear a lot about reverse racism, right? The problem is that most of the time, the people who would be pointed at and saying you're a reverse racist don't have the power to do anything. So the label in and of itself loses its meaning and doesn't allow us to have a decent conversation about power, whether it's political power, economic power, social power, inequality of power, you name it, and what happens when power connects with prejudice. Okay? So this is a great place to start. The fellow who asked, you know, how do you have a discussion without the right definitions? This is a really good place to have a start with definitions. And I'm just going to mention this. When I've done this in smaller groups, folks have said to me, wow, this is a really cool definition because not only does it apply to racism, but I'm thinking about this now. This applies to sexism as well, too. You know, I might really not like women. I don't know why, but some people might feel that way. But unless I use that dislike in a way that subjects a woman to physical, emotional, verbal abuse, Well, I'm prejudiced, but maybe I'm not sexist, okay? So what a good definition, because it allows you to have more of a discussion about the underlying issues that are there. The next one, active listening. I said there were 3 prongs to this discussion, or 3 prongs to the kind of basic steps to have a discussion. Active listening is something that's really easy to do, really easy to say rather, and really hard to do. And it's hard to do because we're brought up in a society where, as I said before, it's talking heads. And anybody who's been in a relationship, I don't have to tell you, you know exactly what that's like. Most of the time when you have a relationship discussion or any discussion, you're listening from the point of view of thinking, what can I say based on what that person said? Oh, I'll say, that person said this. Now, I could say this, and that will really disprove what they said, and then kind of give me a little bit of an edge in there, and I'll have the upper hand, right? I mean, that's the way we have discussions. That is not the way you actively listen. And I can tell you as a psychotherapist, this is what they train you to do, train you to actively listen. There are 3 really important portions of actively listening. The first is you listen without talking. That's tough for a lot of people. Believe me, just that first one. Because you think that when somebody speaks to you, you have to either say what you think at the moment or correct what they're saying. That's not active listening. That's debating, and sometimes that's not even debating, because at least in debating, you're listening to the other side, even if mentally you're not there and you're simply kind of remembering the points that you've written down on your index cards before you respond. Okay, listening without talking. Wow, what a challenge sometimes. Repeating without editing. You know, I hope maybe you saw me trying to do this in the way I listened and repeated back to people what I heard them say. And the idea here is you need to understand that other person, and the way you understand that other person is by saying, did I get you right? And you don't have to use their words. You can use your own words as long as both of you agree that you've got a decent communication going there and that both of you have heard each other. Again, easy to say, a little more challenging to do, but a very important part of having an important discussion about a difficult topic. And how about respect without judging? I find it really interesting that a lot of people think that just listening to somebody who I disagree with means that I kind of believe in what that person is saying that I disagree with. You can listen to somebody you really vehemently don't believe what they're saying or don't like it, you still can listen. And again, I think it's because of my psychotherapy training. We're taught to do that. I mean, part of being a psychotherapist is simply to respect the humanity of the other person on the other side of the couch, table, chair, or whatever your setup is. You don't have to agree with what they're saying, but you can be there to listen. And the one thing I do know about how change happens, and it's not just me knowing this from my experience, the research has been done in this. 1991, 1993, I think it was Scientific American had an article on research that was done about how people change in therapy. And they had 2 groups of people. They had a similar group of people that, they sent to 2 groups of therapists. One group of therapists was highly trained, like me, sat in school a lot, and a lot of butt time to learn about being a therapist. And another group was simply taught something that the famous psychotherapist Albert Maslow said, called holding another person in highest positive regard. That means simply respecting their humanity. It meant listening to the person. You didn't have to say anything. You simply sat there and held that person in high regard as another human being. Might not agree with what they were saying. Well, after 6 months, they did a number of tests, and what they found is that after 6 months, 0 difference in the outcome between the group that went to trained psychotherapists and those that simply went to people who were holding the person across from them in highest positive regard. Now, after that 6-month period, when you needed to really maybe help people make changes and archetype things in their lives, yes, the trained psychotherapist, you started to see some difference. But what's important there is simply being able to say, if it's only to yourself, well, I can listen to this person, it doesn't mean I agree with them. That's important, and I don't think that's something we're often trained to do. Okay, last slide for me is, How do you have a conversation from your head, or excuse me, from your heart and not your head? And typically speaking, it's that conversation from the head. You know, the talking heads, you just have to turn on CNN to see what that's like. And, you know, you got all the panels there and everybody's telling you what they think and people are talking over each other. And the networks love that because that kind of produces all the excitement and everything. But that's not the way you have a conversation. How many times have you listened to that and say, there was no conversation happening there? And for those of you in the relationships, you probably know that's not the way to have a good relationship conversation either. You know, so the question is, how do you do that? It's really fairly easy to say and more difficult to actually do. When you're listening from your heart, you're not saying, what am I thinking about? How can I insert what I believe in here? You're simply saying, when I hear this person speak, how do I feel? It might make me angry, it might make me sad, it might make me happy, it might make me feel a lot of empathy and compassion. It doesn't matter. But if you're having a conversation from your heart, that's how you're listening. How does it make me feel as opposed to how does it make me think, or what does it make me think? And in the same way, if you're speaking, then you're speaking from your heart by saying, this is how I feel as opposed to this is how I think. Again, easily said, but not so easily done. When I was recently out at the Coyote Ridge Correctional Facility, I was speaking to about, 40 or 50 guys there. And the group was segregated by race on one side and by also by kind of position in the prison. And this wasn't like whose gang ran whose gang. It really was who I think had the most respect. And there was a fellow sitting on my left when I was speaking whom everybody called Mr. Washington. Now, he had a first name, but even the librarian called Mr. Washington, and Mr. Washington was kind of the guy. And he wasn't necessarily the tallest or the meanest or the toughest, but he was the guy who kind of controlled the way things happened. And it was very interesting to talk to Mr. Washington. On my right side, there were a group of Puerto Rican fellows and some Asian fellows, and one of the Puerto Rican guys was kind of happy because I was from New York, he was from New York, so he had a homie talking to him. And at the end of the evening, he got up and said to me, because I asked for questions, and he said, you know, it's not safe in prison to speak from your heart. And I get that. But he added, boy, is it really a breath of fresh air to do that. And I thought, you know, when you provide that opportunity for another person, you really can bring about change. Not because you've tried to force that on that person, simply because you've allowed that person to stand in their humanity as you respect that. And so I will never forget that moment because it really reinforced in me the importance of these tools to have a really difficult conversation. And so having said this, I would like to challenge all of you to spend just a few moments trying to enact some of these ideas about a difficult conversation. And so it's a very simple process. I'm going to ask you, hopefully, to find somebody on your right or your left that you don't know that well. And if you need to move around a little bit, I'm fine with that. And then I'm going to ask you to have a conversation around this issue, idea, topic. When was the first time in my life when I recognized that skin color made a difference? When was the first time in my life that I recognized that skin color made a difference? And remember the three ideas with having a difficult conversation, definitions, particularly around race, active listening, and speaking and talking and listening from your heart, not your head. Okay, so I'm going to allow you to do this. I'll keep time. We won't have a long time to do this, but I will tell you when you ought to switch. Oh, okay. For just the general discussion? Great. Okay, sorry. Okay. Thank you. I'd like you to turn around in your seats. And I can say this, judging from the volume of the conversation, you certainly had a lot to say, and thank you for attempting to do this using some of these ideas about how you have a difficult conversation. Obviously, I wasn't able to be at every table, but what I saw most that I could really see here from the podium was the body posture of people engaged in this conversation. And no, I really think that was great, because the people who were listening, you could see them leaning into that conversation a little bit. And I thought that was wonderful, because it told me, as best as I could evaluate, that, you know, you were actively engaged with that person listening. Often you'll see when two people are having a conversation, they're not listening. They're either backing off from each other, or there's a sense of, you know, kind of the tension of leaning in, getting ready for a fight. So I'm glad none of that happened. And I really do want to honor you, and I really appreciate you even attempting for, 5 minutes or so to do that. Before I conclude, let me ask if there's any feedback from doing that, what that was like. I see a hand here. Yes? Sure. Let me repeat. The question was, how do you even start a conversation about race? And I think there's several things that go into that, to an answer to that. First off, you have to recognize that not everybody's willing or ready to have this conversation. And we had this discussion at the table here during lunch. So you have to recognize that. And I think the second thing you have to recognize is you start any conversation by asking if it's okay to have the conversation. It's a question of permission. Just like with anything, you ask first, and based on the answer you get, that's the next step you can take. So asking is a good place. And the third thing is to recognize is that this is just one idea, what I presented about how you engage in a difficult conversation. It is not appropriate to every person or every age group. So we were talking, for example, at lunch, and I'll be going back to Bainbridge Island for, my second or third time within a couple of months next week. And one of the challenges that they've had at Bainbridge Island is that there's a group of young people in their school system who think that it's okay, that there's a First Amendment right to be racist and anti-Semitic. And there have been incidents with, I can't remember whether it was Nazi salute or Nazi symbols or whatever. And so for those young people to do a presentation like this and to sit down and say, you need to have a conversation, it's not going to work. That's not the appropriate tool for that situation. But you know what is appropriate? What the Assistant Secretary of State in Virginia just did, where there was a similar situation where young people were involved in drawing swastikas at a local high school. She said, okay, we're going to prosecute these young people, and here is what the penalty is going to be. You're going to have to read books by Maya Angelou, and you're going to have to read books by Hispanic authors, and you're going to have to read books by Holocaust survivors. And guess what? Not only do you have to read those books, but after you finish reading those books, you have to write a paper on them. And what happens after that, whether you move to some other level of our justice system or not, is directly dependent on what I read in those papers. Wow. Yeah, right, absolutely. And so I listened to her reading the paper of a young man who said, and I could perhaps understand this, that he had no sense of what it meant to be a Holocaust survivor. He knew that the swastika was kind of a rebellious thing, and he thought that was really cool, before he read the stories of a Holocaust survivor. So that's how you start the conversation with that person or that group of people. And what's really important is to understand who it is you're trying to have the conversation with, so you understand how it's appropriate to have that conversation. I think that's really critical. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. All right.
Yes, I just think this is such an interesting discussion, because I moved to the Northwest, Birch Bay, 6 years ago. And I was a realtor back in New Jersey, So I just felt it was a great place. I lived in BC before and I had connections. So I figured it would be a great place to work and settle and retire. The first time I really experienced racism, or what I thought was racism, I'm going to correct that later, was when I moved here. Although I was an experienced realtor, although I knew the ropes, no one wanted to work with me. People talked around me, never talked to me. My offers were not accepted because I didn't know what I was doing. At first, I really thought it was something else. But then I started a conversation with some of the realtors. Instead of getting angry, instead of letting that run me away, I'm very resilient, so I'm not going to run. I started to ask some questions. And as time went on, we found out we had more in common than we were different. I forged some friendships that today are unbelievable. But one of the main things I got from that was that because some of the people I worked with, some of the people I lived amongst, had not dealt with anybody like me, my skin color. So they could not start a conversation with me because they didn't know how to. They saw things on television. People even offered me jobs, cleaning jobs. People people did some things. And I realized it was sort of profiling because they had no idea. This is what they saw on television. They had not actually met anyone like me. Jim, he was my neighbor for a while. And he was one of the most wonderful people, I tell you, that I have run into. And we remained friends until now. He was the one who invited me here. Thanks to the treatment. I mean, amazing. Yeah. So what I found out, and I think some of us have to be careful using the word racism. It is not always that. It is just people don't know. So when you back away or when you get angry, it doesn't solve anything. Ask questions. If I have the measles, I asked one of the girls, I'm going to be sure, when I asked one of the people at the office I was working with, I won't mention the name, I said, if I came in here with the measles and you sat next to me, would you catch anything else or would you catch the measles? I said, and it would be the same measles. I said, when I bleed, what color is my blood? I said, I said, what do you like to eat? And I started making dishes for people, and they liked the food. They liked, so to tell you, I really enjoyed this, and I just wanted to share my story, and I wanted to thank all the wonderful people in Whatcom County for welcoming me. Thank you.
And let me just say thank you for saying that. One of the things I take away from what I heard you say, and please correct me if I didn't get this exactly right, is that you don't always have to react in anger, but part of starting a conversation is sometimes even using some of the wonderful humor that you had in terms of breaking down the barriers. So there's lots of ways to engage in a conversation, but I heard you saying that you were courageous enough to take some of the first steps. And so I certainly applaud you for doing that. Thank you.
This is a little bit off that topic, but I wanted to bring up that in the county, we have Indian friends, Native Americans, and we have made great strides in getting to know those people, our neighbors, and they are actively involved in our organization in the 42nd District. And at every meeting that we have now, we acknowledge that they were the first people on this earth, or in this area, that we now occupy. So I think that we've made great strides in, and they have helped us by acknowledging us, and we are definitely acknowledging them as they come into our organization. So I just wanted to say that is part of the racism question.
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, for saying that. You know, one of the things that I certainly share with my friend here who was speaking was what it was like to be an African-American here in Bellingham 30 years ago. So that was a long time ago. And I will say this, one of the things I was first aware of is that what I call the designated minority was, and I use, you know, kind of both humorous but also poignant. Here in Whatcom County, we're the Lummies, we're the natives, and I think there's still a long way for us to go. I think that there's a lot more, and I think it's very important that we acknowledge that our Lummi brothers and sisters were here before us, and there's a lot more we can do. So thank you very much.
You know that and this is a community thing, and how to start a difficult conversation and how to get through that. You know that 1907 Bellingham riots, that a lot of people know, a lot of people may not know. So we built an arch of healing reconciliation in front of City Hall. I just want to tell you the background of that. So there were 356 people from India living in Bellingham. They were expelled, and 100 years went by. And kids like me came here having no other knowledge and got a job in Bellingham, get in Bellingham. So when we found out that there was a 2007 was going to be 100 years anniversary of that, and how do we recognize that or bring it to the public, that was a very difficult conversation. So Tim Douglas was the mayor for a while at that time in Bellingham, and Pete Crimmen was the county executive. So we had a committee of 5-6 people. It took up 6 months. We did research, found newspapers, all that data, and then we said, how do we approach the government? Like, you know, this is the two big governments where it happened. And I talked to Terry Burneman, and they said, well, just go talk to them. You know, start the conversation. And that's what we did when we had all these newspapers, all the evidence and all this. They said, we have no idea. So the long story short is they asked us, okay, what would you want to do? What do you want to do with this now? We said, well, there is a 100 years anniversary. We want to recognize the history of Bellingham, that this happened here to the immigrants at that time. So we were thinking about it. It took us a month to find out, and finally we settled on, why don't we declare a day of healing and reconciliation? Because there was no other way. That was the difficult conversation. It became easier once we did this, and the county and the city jointly, and we did a ceremony in the rotunda, and 200 some people came and declared September 4, 2007 as Day of Healing and Reconciliation. Now, 10 years later, another situation came. Me and Tim got together. We wanted to build a memorial. So the difficult conversation was within our community. There are a lot of Sikhs there, and I had a lot of resistance. What kind of memorial you want to build? And the biggest thing was, we want a revenge. I'll keep it just very short. That people were of the view that something happened to our ancestors, we must have a revenge. You know, or we must have some kind of apology letter. So it took us actually a few months to reason it out. That's a difficult conversation with your own people. This is not racism, but it can be racism within your own community. The people were of the view that that's what they want. We said, no, we don't gain anything. We need to work with the larger community. This is a teaching and a learning moment, and that's what we need to capture. And then we were able to talk to the Chinese community, because they had an incident in 1885. We were able to talk to Japanese community because of 1942 internment. We combined all this. And I think the advice was Tim and Paul Engelsberg and few other people. We had to reason with our own people. And finally we came around. So these are the two examples of difficult conversation, how to start, how to do. Persevere. If you have the right ideas, you got to keep talking. And then I was told, Satpal, you're not going to get any money for this. We went to Whatcom Community Foundation. After our first presentation, they gave a check for $25,000. Our community was totally flipped. They did not expect. They said, well, nobody's going to give you any money because the project was $100,000. They said, oh, these people are all prejudiced against us and they will never give you anything. And they were flipped. And turn around, our community raised $50,000 in a few days. Because that bridge, that these people, what you are assuming in your head is not true. So I just wanted to share that because it is our local incident.
Thank you very much. First, thank you, Satpal. And I just want to say that for me, that's an example of not retributive justice, but really restorative justice. And I think that is so important. And we need that here in our county. We need that here in the state. We need that here in our nation as well, too. And it's examples like that that really give me a lot of hope. So thank you again. Yes?
With your experience in academia, I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are, what comments you would make with regard to the content of your presentation here today regarding our public school system and our public university system.
Wow, that's not a small question. The one area that I really think this kind of discussion intersects with what's going on both in public schools and universities is this whole question about safe space. Safe space. And I have to say that I am of the opinion that what we see a lot particularly in higher universities where I don't want to be around somebody who I don't agree with, and I want you, the university, to provide me a safe space so I don't have to be around that. I don't necessarily feel that that's the way you help produce people who can engage in difficult conversations. I do think the idea of safe spaces is important, but I believe you create safe space in your ability to engage other people, and as I said earlier, simply hold them with some regard for their humanity. That is a safe space that allows for a difficult conversation. What passes for safe space now is really creating an echo chamber where you're only going to hear what you already believe in, and I don't think that brings about change. So that's one area that I think is very important. And I think you heard me say something earlier about what's going on in Bainbridge Island, where I think what you have to do, and I really believe that what you have to do, particularly with young people, is you have to approach them at the levels they're at. You cannot necessarily give them 3 pillars of difficult conversation and say, okay, now you've got everything you need to know. It doesn't work that way. Whether it's the textbooks that they're reading, whether it's engaging them through social media, which is the way that they're very used to, whether it's pulling them off social media and saying you got to talk to people now because that's important. You need to really be sensitive to who it is you're addressing and understand who they are and then architect your strategies based on that. That's one of the things I'm trying to do with the Bainbridge Island school system there, is to help them determine how to approach the students that believe there's a First Amendment right to be racist and anti-Semitic. So thank you for your question, and I hope that's at least the beginning answer. Yes?
Thank you. Like the nice lady over here, they're 2 Jersey boys. You're amongst friends here.
Where in Jersey?
I'm from Lakewood.
Okay.
Plainfield.
All right. Well, all right. So I lived in New York City and then I moved to New Jersey. So, okay.
I have 2 points.
Yes.
The first one, I want some advice. In our discussion that you permitted us to have. I relayed an example of moving from New Jersey to Delaware, and this is years ago. And in the apartment, the phone installer was there, and he was installing the phone, and apropos of nothing, he makes a negative comment about black people to me. A, I was shocked, because I'm kind of a progressive guy, and B, I didn't know how to react. And I thought to myself, I'm never going to see this guy again. I'm just going to let it go. My friend from New Jersey said, you know, I might have handled it differently. I might have said something to him, if only to let him know there are other points of view in the world. And I'm asking you, is there any general guidance you would offer in that type of circumstance?
You know, I can't tell you what it is that you needed to do in that situation, but it seems to me that you're questioning what you did right now, which suggests to me that what's most important is for you to continue to question yourself and in the future determine whether you want to respond the way you did before. So I think that's important, that these situations are as much about what happens with another person or as perhaps even more so what happens with us in that moment. Because, you know, perhaps it is that you learn something about what you would like to do, so the next time that happens, you won't respond the same way. And I think it's also important to recognize in some situations, the first consideration you have is your safety. Now, I don't get that that was the situation here, but there can be situations, we teach this in intervention or a bystander intervention training, that before you intervene with another person, you got to make sure you're safe in that environment. So as long as you are questioning it, I think that's great. And I think that's the most that you can do is to question it so that when it happens again, you will have had the benefit of however many years of looking at that situation and knowing if you felt good about how you responded then.
Thank you. I'll be brief. My second point is not a question. It's a thank you.
Well,
Hold on. I've been involved with the Bellingham City Club since its beginning. And as our president indicated at the beginning of the meeting, the purpose of this club is to educate, to inform, to allow civil dialogue so that people can disagree without being disagreeable and perhaps learn something that, as you're suggesting, might make us a little bit better person. And the talk today was a perfect example of what this club is all about. And I came to this meeting thinking, what else can I learn about racism? I'm from New Jersey. I learned a lot, and I appreciate it. I think the membership does as well. And on behalf of the City Club, thank you very much.
oh, you're welcome. Thank you. So I look forward to being back with you again. Thank you so much for what you do. Love you guys. Love this city. Thanks again.